Welcome to Midlife Hip Pain. I want to share not only my experience, but the fact that in dealing with my experience, I have found and discovered that there are so many women in midlife who are dealing with hip pain who have no clue that it is very possible to not only heal it, but get better from it. And a lot of times we write it off to being old or write it off to being female who doesn't have hormones anymore, that kind of thing. And that, while that may be the experience one is having, it does not have to be that way. What I will say is that while we have more knowledge today than we have ever had regarding menopause before and after, most of that information is coming from the fitness world, the fitness research, because our hormones affect our performance and when we're athletes. And so the good news is there are a couple people out there really sharing that information and making sure to spread the news that just because you're not a professional athlete does not mean you're not an athlete. So a lot of this information out there is spoken of in regards to athletes. So if you hear that, listen up, because if you are active on a regular basis at all, it applies to you. Plus, it still applies to you because whatever in the athlete's world they say that the woman's body is behaving like, it's still the woman's body. Okay, so I want you to pay attention anytime you hear that. So I want to talk about my experience a little bit first, and then I want to talk about the tons of information that you could come across that could be very overwhelming and very much turn you away from trying to figure it out on your own. You're never alone. You can always come to me, and if I can't help you, I will direct you in a direction that would be most helpful to you. But there are people out there that can help you. So midlife hip pain. Women, when they begin their menopause cycle, and when I say begin the menopause cycle, what I mean is when they begin having zero periods, okay? They haven't reached the full 1 year yet, but when they begin having zero periods, that means that your estrogen has began to lower, drop, maybe it crashed, kind of like mine felt like it did. But that is the beginning of really seriously low to no estrogen, okay? I realize that perimenopause, premenopause, it kind of starts fluctuating, but I'm telling you in that day when you say, okay, the last time I had a period was, whether it's been a year or not, that's when I'm talking about here from that phase out specifically, okay? Because that is when the estrogen really starts to drop. So what I want to talk about is I'm going to list off some things. You have a PDF that you can look at. It's going to have this information on there as well. I simplified this down to about a third of the information that is out there, but can sound very, very complicated. It sounds very, very medical. It's got a lot of medical terms to the lay woman, okay, to the lay woman. But first I'm going to talk about the fact that what is hip pain, because that's a rather large area. You have the front, the back, the side, you have the inside, you have the upper, the lower, that kind of thing. So you have the front of the groin, okay, right where your leg meets your lower abdominals, that crease. Okay, that crease in the front of the thigh and under the belly, that is your front groin area. Then you have your buttocks, your butt cheeks, okay? They have that whole area, the whole butt cheek itself. You have the lumbar spine, okay? So that would be your lower back from the T12 under, okay? You would have that area that we're talking about when we're talking about midlife pain, hip pain. The side of the hip, so literally quite on the very side of the hip, where you might carry a child on the side of your hip, okay? You have that whole area. And then your upper leg, lower leg, and your calf, those three items definitely get affected because of nerves, okay? Because whatever nerve crosses through the hip, that's the nerves that extend down into all the way to the toes, all right? So the front groin area, the buttocks, the lumbar spine, the side hip, and then the upper lower leg and the calf. Those areas are all affected by this hip pain that tends to plague almost all midlife women that I have encountered so far in some degree or another, okay? Now, because of the low estrogen, our muscles and our tendons start to get weaker because we don't have that estrogen helping to keep them healthy, which is why my passion, my mission is to catch women in their 40s and help them pre-strengthen before this happens. Okay, so I want to put that message right out there. But the tendons specifically and the muscle tissue begins to deteriorate even faster. And if you've never heard this quote, I'm going to tell you now, once you pass 30, your bones are done creating themselves, and you are then, at that point, always losing muscle unless you're making muscle. That is why it's so important that you find activity, that you lift heavy things, that you make your bones and your muscles work hard, okay? So what I'm going to talk about next is a list of items that you may hear the title of, or that you may have heard somebody had an issue with. These are all the things that can come about once your body stops producing estrogen and you're not combating it with other avenues. Adhesions and or scar tissue and or stuck fascia. Those are all kind of in the same category. We have a layer of fascia. The fascia just goes throughout the entire body, but to make it simple, fascia is that layer of stuff between the skin and the muscle. So it's kind of like if you've ever prepared chicken, when you go to peel the skin off, there's that fuzzy layer in between. That is a layer of fascia. It helps with gliding, okay? Gliding the skin over that muscle. That can get very, very stuck if you've got any scar tissue in or near that. That scar tissue can grow and it starts creeping up. I like to call it kind of like cobwebs or such. And it creates a stuckness. So let's say that the skin doesn't move much. That's a stuckness. And that's what adhesions or scar tissue and stuck fascia can do. Next is tendinopathy. Okay, tendinopathy has more to do with the disorganization of your tendons. Okay, when you don't have that estrogen coming in and your nutrients coming in are not supplying enough of what your tendons need to regenerate, it takes just very little harm or a very little trip or a very little accident or overworking or whatever to really strain those tendons, and then they begin to, what I like to think of as, fray. But it's officially called disorganization, and those tendons become weak. And when they become weak and start pulling on the bone, we have a lot of pain. So there's tendinopathy, and gluteal tendinopathy is probably the most common. So you have 3 areas on your butt cheek itself, one on the low back, one on the side hip, and one underneath where the leg meets. And you have those areas that tend to get the most worn, the most torn, and the most painful. Then you have muscle inhibition. Muscle inhibition happens when you have not been using that muscle enough, properly, maybe barely any at all, and then that muscle begins to be turned off by the brain. Okay? I'm going to give you an example. Gluteus medius, that is a side hip muscle that tends to be one of the first things I find that it's not working on any of the women I work with, and a lot of men too, but the women specifically. Like, they don't even know that it's there, and I wouldn't know it's there if I were not a trainer, okay? So one of the first things that I do is I start making their brain connect to it, because you can tell them to do exercises all day long. If this brain doesn't know how to get a hold of that muscle, it's not going to work, and therefore causes more pain. So muscle inhibition is an issue that we talk about or work with. Then you have hip impingement. Hip impingement is where that leg bone comes up into the socket. Okay, here's the leg bone, here's the socket of the hip. And when the leg goes to come forward, it pinches. Okay, you get a pinching on the acetabulum, which is the lining of the joint, or maybe the labrum, or maybe any of the tissues or bursitis or whatever fluid in there. You start pinching, and sometimes those bones can rub on each other enough that it begins to form bone spurs. Okay, so there's hip impingement, and then you have the bursitis, which is very common in a lot of the joints. Okay, and that's just kind of like an irritation, inflammation inside the joint itself. Your overactive sympathetic nervous system. Now, that's a lot of words, and if you're not really familiar with the nervous system, you're not sure what that means, okay? We have a nervous system. Most of us have heard that. That nervous system has 2 modes we're going to talk about. We call it fight or flight, and we call it rest and digest. This one is called sympathetic. This one's called parasympathetic. So again, those are just terms that are used within the scientific community or medical community. But really it's fight or flight, rest and digest. And I'll try to use both as I talk about them. But officially it's called overactive sympathetic nervous system. So overactive fight or flight. Okay. Overactive fight or flight nervous system. That is probably the most that I have seen since the year 2020 began. So I see this one so much that it's the first thing I talk about anymore is we have to have some control over our nervous system before we can make the muscles do anything. Before those muscles, body, the tendons, any of it, before we can learn to control it, we have to learn to control this nervous system. Okay. Nerve entrapment. Okay. Nerve entrapment is a really big one. The more I study this, the more I realize the amount of nerve bundles that run through that crease in your groin is amazing. And it makes complete sense to me why we have neuropathy and pains down through our lower body when we sit as much as we do and we have weak butt cheek muscles. Okay. So nerve entrapment, it also happens right through here. We have a huge bundle of nerves and blood flow that come through here. And we have a huge bundle that go through the groin on each side. So nerve entrapment. The last one I'm going to talk about that we hear more often is piriformis syndrome. Right in the butt cheek, you have a handful of little muscles. So here's your tailbone, and from the tailbone out to the leg bone, you have about, I'd say generally 5 or 6 little muscles. They look like a group of little spider muscles that go out to the side, and those are your external rotators. And when we sit a lot and we don't strengthen our gluteal muscles or your butt cheek muscles, when they're not being strengthened on purpose, these get over tight, and sometimes they're lengthened and over tight, and sometimes they're shortened and over tight, but they're weak. And those, you have one muscle called the piriformis, that one of those 5 or 6 that come across, that sciatic nerve comes down from the upper body, runs underneath that piriformis muscle. When that piriformis muscle gets tight, it's putting pressure on your sciatic nerve. So that's the last one that I'm going to talk about. So in general, these things happen, one, from low estrogen in the estrogen effects not being replaced. And then they happen from too much activity, too little activity, habitual posture imbalances, physical and mental stress, and LEA, which we're going to talk a lot about. LEA, that is low energy availability, and that has to do with your nutrition. So we're going to talk about those things coming up.